Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. And this morning, we have Jill McMillan with us from the University Library. And Jill is going to be presenting this morning on how to, of course, it's covered up. This is about researching and your sources for your literature review. Reading, analyzing, and organizing your sources for your literature review. I should have wrote it down. Trying to pull it out of my head. I should know better. Thanks, Jill, for being with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. Please make sure that you are on mute and that if you're not presenting, of course, none of the rest of you are except for Jill. If you could turn your video off, and I will do the same. And yeah, Jill, thank you very much. You can take it away.
All right, perfect. So thanks again for coming out this morning. I'll keep my video on for the first few minutes, but then I'll turn it off just because it might be a little bit distracting. So as already stated, today's session is all about reading, analyzing, and organizing sources for your literature review. So this is making the assumption that you've collected a bunch of wonderful information, and now you're just trying to start interacting with it in order to start creating the foundation for your literature review. So my name is Jill McMillan. I'm actually a graduate writing specialist, but I am also happy to connect with undergraduate students as well. If you ever want to get in touch with me, please send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. So if you have any questions following today's session, don't hesitate, feel free to get in touch. I also want to point out a few writing supports that are available for students at USask. We have two forms of one-to-one writing support. These are free and come highly recommended. So if you want to get information via email or in real time, we have the ability to do both, and you'll be connected with one of the trained writing tutors through the Writing Center. And we also have a number of online resources, including the USask Writing Help Guide. So I would encourage you to make use of that resource as well. Today's focus, we're going to ask, well, why should we talk about reading in the first place? And we have a couple of opportunities in today's session to contribute in the chat screen. So I hope that you take advantage and participate in that. And one of the questions that we'll be looking at is, well, why talk about reading at all? Then we're going to spotlight some questions that we can ask when we are looking at all of this literature that we have collected, and then starting to, again, create that foundation and that structure for our literature review by thinking, how can I start organizing these sources? We'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. If you want to stay in chat, I'm more than happy to, or if you want to send me an email, please feel free to do so. Okay, so why talk about reading? Let's take about 2 minutes if you want to open up your chat box and just respond to this question. Why should we bother talking about reading? So we'll take about 2 minutes.
Hello, where's this chat box? Reading. Reading.
So I've just been watching all of these contributions, and I'm just already so impressed with the range of feedback that's coming in. So everything from developing reading as a lifelong skill, that recognition that we have to adapt to reading a new context, we have to adjust to reading within fields that we may not be familiar with, being concerned about becoming more effective and efficient in our reading, building our knowledge about our topic, being able to survey effectively what has been researched in our area of study. This is fantastic. This is what I was hoping that you would start to identify, so that's great. So reading is this highly, highly complex skill, and it's something that sometimes we kind of forget about because, you know, at this point, we can make the assumption that we all are pretty good readers. That's one of the things that we could say with, I think, a lot of certainty. But when we start thinking about reading in a more abstract or higher level way, we might recognize, oh, wait a minute, this is something that is really highly complex and is something that we have to learn over the course of many years. So I've taken a sampling from many different languages around the world. Would anyone like to venture what this, all of these different languages are referencing? We'll see if we have a lot of bilingual or multilingual speakers here. Does anyone want to make a guess what we're looking at? So these are all examples of the word apple being expressed in multiple languages. And so I like to have an exercise like this simply to demonstrate that reading is so complex, it's culturally dependent, and having this recognition in mind, I think, is very useful in order to start thinking about our reading strategies. So reading, it is partly a matter of decoding letters, words, punctuation, for instance. But when we start talking about something like reading fluency or reading comprehension, this is actually dependent on many other factors as well. So as we're reading, our brain and our eyes are engaging with a lot of really interesting processes at one time. So our fluency and comprehension is going to be dependent on prior knowledge, and this includes both content as well as text conventions. So if you're not familiar with a particular text type, it's going to take a little bit of time to familiarize yourself with what the expectations and conventions are when looking at a text like this. So it might not have been until university, for instance, that you first saw a journal article in an academic journal, for instance. And so it would take some time to get familiar with that text type. Likewise, content. So the more content we have, the more content knowledge that we have, the easier and faster it is for us to read. But if we are reading about something that we don't have a lot of prior knowledge about, it's going to be more difficult to work through all that information. Contextual cues will also help us decode and extract meaning and make meaning. And lastly, style. So an author's style can help or hinder us when we are reading. And this is something that we want to be mindful as writers as well. That's our responsibility as writers to ensure that things are being communicated as clearly as possible to our intended reader. So reading, as already sort of pointed out in the chat, it can be a highly efficient way to learn. It's one of the best ways that we have available to us to learn. But it can also be a very inefficient way if we're not reading with intention and with purpose. So we want to be mindful of our current reading habits. We want to ask ourselves, am I reading strategically? Am I reading critically? Am I retaining information? I think a common experience, or at least my experience, has been sometimes I've read something, I've spent 20 minutes reading something, and I don't remember any of what I've read, and I have to go back and reread it. And that becomes then a very inefficient and ineffective use of my time because I have to go back and reread. So drawing on those sort of experiences, I want to highlight today the value in exploring some new reading strategies, especially as they relate to academic texts. Because with academic text, you want to consider both the purpose of an academic text, which is to share new knowledge with a reader, and also a recognition of the volume of information you have to read as an academic. And I think that's one of the things that's really challenging about reading in university is simply the amount of reading that is expected on a regular basis. So when we are reading, we want to make sure that we're retaining and understanding and engaging with that information as much as possible. So the first strategy that we're going to look at a little bit today is an oldie but a goodie. It's called SQ3R. Scan, question, read with intention, recite, and review. This has been around since the 1940s, and it's promoted in part for study as a means to retain information, but I think it applies just as well to reading for the purposes of gathering information for literature review, in that it is about trying to make the best use out of your time as possible. So the first part of this strategy is scanning. So here I've taken an excerpt from, I believe it's a sociology text. And again, that layout is probably very familiar to those of us who have spent a lot of time with textbooks in the past, a lot of quite dense text. But with this strategy, we can, again, engage with it as efficiently as possible. So with scanning, what we're doing is we are quickly looking at a chapter. We're scanning for major concepts. We want to look at this chapter as a chunk. We want to engage with any information that has been provided that might make it easier for us to evaluate whether or not we need to continue to read this text. I think one of the things about being an efficient reader in university is always being able to determine as quickly as possible whether or not you want to continue reading something. So with scanning, we're checking what are the major concepts in this chapter. If there's a chapter summary available, usually at the end of a chapter, read that first. Look at the headings, just get a sense of what this chapter is all about. Second, then once we have a quick sense, again, that this would take about 30 seconds to do to quickly scan, then we want to look again really quickly, asking ourselves, what prior knowledge am I bringing to this? What do I already know about the focus of this text? What do the authors seem to be emphasizing in this text? Why are they emphasizing this information? And what information is new to me, or what new information do I need to know? So we'll also be looking at some strategies more specific to journal articles. But yes, you could use the SQ3R for journal articles as well. Then we're going to read, and we're going to make use of this mental framework that we've created through our scanning and our initial questioning to really start interrogating the text. This is when we start making some quick jot notes. We might include reactions, asking like, why have they said this? We might be generating more questions at this point as well. And then if you're interested in retaining information, as you're going through gathering these jot notes together, you're going to start thinking about, what's important here? What can I summarize in terms of the purpose, the key ideas, the key terms, the answers to questions? So reciting either out loud or making some additional notes, that is going to help to start secure some of this information into your memory. And lastly, then we can review by synthesizing those jot notes, those summaries, and incorporating any additional detail that you think is relevant. So now we're going to move on to a second reading strategy, and this is a little bit more specific to a journal article. And we're going to look at journal articles primarily in terms of their format and how we might engage with this pretty conventional format that we see when we look at a published article. So the conventional format is as follows. We have our title, our abstract, our introduction, or our literature review, often a combination, our methodology, our results, our discussion, and or conclusion. Again, sometimes this can be combined, and then our references. Here I've taken an excerpt from the Journal of Bone Oncology, and we see in a very condensed way that several of these features are already present just in the first page. Now, within other disciplines, of course, that introduction or that literature review could be much longer. So you are going to encounter some disciplinary variation in terms of the length or the scope or the breadth of some of these sections. So we might be tempted to read as the format sort of suggests, right? We were taught to read from beginning, middle, end, but it doesn't quite work as effectively for academic articles. And so I would suggest that we don't want to approach a journal article in the same way when it comes to initially evaluating that text type. Instead, what we want to consider first is that abstract, then look at the references, discussion and conclusion, introduction, methodology, and results. So it's going to involve moving around the text a lot, but with each step, it's really going to give you an indication as to whether or not you need to continue engaging and reading this text. Because when you're gathering information for a literature review, you are always making that judgment about whether or not that text is going to influence your review, if it's going to be included or referenced in some way. So again, we're using, similar to the SQ3R method, we are doing a lot of skimming initially. And this is going to help provide us that mental framework in case we want to engage more deeply with this text. But first, we're going to look at that abstract. We're going to be asking ourselves, does this study seem relevant to my research? Is it worth my time to continue reading this? And again, we're only taking 1 or 2 minutes for each of these sections because we're just making initial evaluations at this point. Then we're going to move on to references because we want to get a sense of how the author or authors have actually generated the foundation for their research. So if you see some authors that you would expect to see in that reference list, that might be a good indication that, okay, this study is perhaps of interest to me. If you've ever been a TA, you might have also found yourself when grading student work that one of the first things that you do is go to the reference list in order to start getting a sense of the rigor of the research. And we do the same thing here. Then we're going to move on to discussion and conclusion. Sorry about that. I think one of the things with working remotely is that I'm not talking as often. And so sometimes when I'm doing a workshop, it's a little bit out of practice. No worries, I'm fine. Okay, and then we're looking at our discussion and conclusion. And we want to know, what are the main findings of this work? What seems interesting to us as fellow researchers? And lastly, or not quite lastly, but next we're going to look at that introduction. What is the rationale? What is the theoretical framework that these researchers have made use of to justify their research question? Next, we're looking at methodology. And when we're looking at the methodology, this is when we're asking, okay, what kind of study has been designed to answer this research question? And then lastly, we're looking at the results. What kind of data has been generated? So once you've skimmed the entire journal article, then you get to determine, okay, am I going to engage in some deep reading here? And at this point, if you decide, yes, this article is worth looking at more closely, then you look at it from that introduction to conclusion format in order to start really interrogating this text in a meaningful way. And so as we assess someone else's study, this in turn is generating analysis. And analysis is all about asking questions, which will start moving into the next part of our workshop today. So what kind of questions or what types of questions should I ask? Let's take about 3 minutes to start generating some common questions that we might ask in the text box. All right, once again, I'm so impressed with the questions that everyone is generating. We're seeing a wide range of questions, and these are questions that can be applicable to any research study, basically. Someone surfaced earlier, does the methodology actually fit well with the research question? And that's a question I really love, because it might be that you have a really fantastic research question, you have really interesting methodology, but they don't quite align. And so that lack of alignment can be problematic as a result, especially if you're looking to be able to generalize the results of research. So are we seeing results that are consistent with the work of other scholars? This is really great. Anytime you can see sort of disagreement within the field, this is something that you really want to dive into to see how scholars are approaching similar problems, but in very different ways, or finding very different results. What's the nature of the publication? Is it peer-reviewed? Is it a high-impact journal? These are, again, are all really fantastic questions. So one of the things, and I'm not sure that everyone needs this, it seems like we are generating a lot of really good questions, but sometimes, especially if we're operating in a discipline that we don't have a lot of prior knowledge about, we might be a bit uncertain about the types of questions we can ask. And this is where I always want to reassure students that, we have expectations around sort of gold standards in terms of research design, but even those gold standard studies aren't necessarily perfect. Yes, high quality studies are plentiful, they do exist, but whether or not there's a perfect study is quite questionable. And this is because researchers face multiple challenges and constraints when they are conducting their research. So we're looking at funding. Unless you are in a very privileged position, very few researchers have unlimited funding available to them. Time pressure. So there might be an expectation to publish research on an ongoing basis, and sometimes that results in shorter or more contained studies that might not be perfect for answering a particular question. There are also major ethical considerations, especially in the social sciences. There's some studies that they would be very, very interesting to run, but we can't do it for ethical considerations. So with these sort of limitations in mind, I think that can be very freeing to us as emerging academics and scholars to feel that we can provide a sense of critical perspective to work that has been produced. So this is perhaps going to be a very basic refresher for most of you, but sometimes it's good to review. And this is going to be informed by any research methods courses that you might have taken in the past. Again, one of the intents, I think, of a research methods course is to highlight different possibilities for bias: researcher bias, participant bias, measurement bias, sampling bias. For instance, you might have heard of what's referred to as weird populations, so Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Simply, this refers primarily to North American post-secondary students. This is a population that has been disproportionately studied because of their availability to academic researchers. But it might be that you have populations that are being sampled in urban areas more so than rural areas, or you might have specific groups being under or overrepresented based on gender, age, religion, etc., etc. So depending on your field of study, the bias that you're going to have to be mindful of might be a little bit different. But again, being aware of these different forms of bias can be another means by which we are giving ourselves that permission to critique. So once we have given ourselves this permission to start really critically engaging with the literature that we've gathered, we want to start asking more targeted questions. Again, I recognize this can be quite challenging if you're operating in an area outside of your area of expertise. So being able to determine what is or isn't relevant is going to be a learning curve. It's challenging. I've been there. I've been a research assistant many years ago. And it was in an area that I didn't really have any relevant knowledge about. And so part of becoming a more effective research assistant meant having really open communication with the professor that I was working with. So even before you begin your research process, being very strategic in the conversations that you're having with your project lead or the professor who's in charge of the project is really imperative. So having that focused research question in advance, first of all, that's going to help reduce the number of results that are generated. And so it means that you won't have to sift through as much literature in the first place, because you're not going to be generating perhaps 10,000 results. You might still be generating 2,000 results, which is still a huge amount of literature to work through. But having that more narrowed and focused research question is going to help mitigate just that initial challenge of having too much literature to sift through. Again, in those conversations with your project lead or your professor, you want to determine what are the expectations with regards to the search strategy. Do they want you to target specific databases over others? Do they want you to do a larger search? What those expectations are going to be very useful to have an awareness of. Understanding what the research aims of the project are can also help inform your later evaluation of the literature. And also being aware of any inclusion or exclusion criteria. This is part of the expectations of a more formal systematic review. But in any sort of literature review, it's very useful to have a clear understanding what should I be including and what is an immediate exclusion criteria. So it might be that you are looking at a problem. There's been a lot of research in the UK, for instance, but those papers aren't of concern to you for this particular project. Your project lead wants you just to look at data that has been generated in Canada. And so that's immediately going to give you the freedom to quickly disregard different papers. Or it might be that your project lead wants you to look at projects that have a specific methodology. And so that will also help you make that judgment about what should be included and what should be excluded from your literature review. Okay, so once you have that framework in place and you have, you know, your lovely stack of articles, or you have a bunch of folders on your computer, this is when you're going to start asking those really targeted questions in order to start generating the information that is going to form your literature review. Because it's in asking these sort of questions, engaging with this sort of assessment and analysis is where you're going to be creating the analysis that will be highlighted in your literature review. So we're going to focus on a couple of different areas, and you'll see that we have more targeted questions for some areas than others. And this is because in asking these sort of questions, it can often generate that level of analysis that can be very, very useful to highlight in your literature review. So let's begin with purpose. So what problem has been identified? When we are producing scholarly literature, when we are designing research studies, it's to answer a specific problem or issue that the researcher has surfaced. So what's the problem? Does the study what does the study intend to do? And does it achieve its purpose? So we might aim to investigate one issue, but we actually generate information that it's not closely related to what that initial problem was, but we still surfaced a lot of other information. And so it's not that those results should be discounted, but we just want to identify that, hey, there's a bit of a disconnect here. We want to consider things like value. What knowledge will this study contribute to the field? And as well, is the research question even worth investigating? Because we can investigate a wide range of questions, and not all of them will necessarily have much value. Of course, if you're gathering information from reputable journals and reputable sources, there is a little bit of an assumption that we can make in terms of the fact that the journal editors will have already made some value judgment about the value of the work that they're publishing. So some of these questions, we want to recognize that, again, if something's been published in a reputable source, there has already been a level of vetting that has taken place. but we still want to be asking these questions. When we look at the sources, are the sources of sufficient range and or quality? So are these good quality sources? Are they relevant sources? Have any particular sources that you would expect to be present? Are they not present? So these are some questions to ask. Where you can really start honing in a little bit is around things like methodology, because interrogating someone's research design, their methodology, this is often where you can generate a lot of critique, simply because, again, you have so many different ways in which you might design a study. And so engaging with how someone has designed their study, and if you think that it could have been designed in a different way, it's quite useful to really interrogate how they have gone about answering their research question. So who or what was studied? How was it rationalized? What tools were used? Why? What type of data was collected? Was it qualitative, quantitative, both? Why? How? Again, what was the justification for gathering this sort of data? Were controls in place? If not, why weren't they? Was the method appropriate for answering the research question? Were appropriate statistical tests used? So if they're using a test that seems strange for answering or for looking at the data, you can surface that in your critique. When looking at the results and data, any surprises? Any time that there's something interesting or surprising that might be worth focusing in on? Do you find that the results are generalizable? Was sufficient data actually produced? How is the data presented? How looking at any charts or graphs, for instance, is that data being presented in an effective way? Looking at the discussion, how do the authors interpret the data? What are the strengths or limitations of this interpretation? Does the author make use of logical fallacies when interpreting their results? Again, in that discussion question, there's a lot of interpretation that's happening. And so this, again, is an area rich generating your own critique and your own thoughts. Speaking of which, this is the last section that we're going to highlight for asking targeted questions. Your own thoughts. This is where you can really start to engage meaningfully with the literature that you have gathered together. So what were the strengths, weaknesses, limitations of the study? How does the work relate to other relevant theories or ideas or other studies that you've encountered? Does this seem to be sort of a rogue study, or does this seem to complement a lot of what's been said in this area? Can you think of other experiments, methodology, or investigations that could test the stated conclusion? Could this study stand up to a level of rigor if it was to be investigated again? Is the author making any assumptions, and are they justified, or are you able to poke holes in the assumptions that they might be making? Are you able to detect any possible bias? What are the implications of this? Do we see the possibility for the results being generalized beyond the scope of the study or the experiment? The practical implications of the findings? Who funded the study? Who are the key stakeholders? Often you'll see in journal articles, there will a statement of conflict, for instance, or a statement of funding. So if you are an agricultural student, for instance, and if you see that Monsanto is funding a study, you might look at that particular study a little bit more critically because of the potential vested interest of the funders. What should be done moving forward? Have the authors made interesting claims about future research, or are there claims or pathways that you can identify, rather? And if you could have a few minutes to chat with the author or the authors about this study, what would you ask? What would you want to find out? So there's a question, are logical fallacies leaps of logic? In a sense. So there are multiple forms of logical fallacies, and this is where on the surface something might seem logical, but if you were to pull it apart, the logic falls apart. So for instance, you might hear of the straw man argument, for instance, in a political context. Yeah, so there are multiple logical fallacies that exist. If you're interested in exploring this, there are a lot of resources out there. If you look at logical fallacies and rhetoric, some of that will generate some useful resources for you. Okay, so now we're moving into our last section of our workshop today. How can I organize my sources? So you can either answer this question, how can I organize my sources, or you can share how you currently organize your research. So we'll take about 2 minutes, and then we'll dive into the wonderful world of organization. So we're seeing a range of different programs that are being surfaced, and that's something that we're going to briefly touch on. So things like Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote. We have reference to sticky notes. I'm definitely a paper person, but I recognize that not everyone is. Annotated bibliographies, that's something that we're going to briefly discuss as well. Using Word for simple note-taking, there was reference to Excel. So we have quite a wide range of options available to us when we are looking at how to organize sources. And so we're going to look at a few today, just to, again, bring to your awareness of different approaches or strategies that you may not have been aware of previously. So citation management software. This, again, has been surfaced by a few contributors in the chat. Basically, these are programs that allow you to import and organize citations from online databases. So it includes EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, among others. I am not an expert when it comes to citation management software, but if you want to make use of these programs and would like some guidance, feel free to connect with your subject librarian or email citation.managers@library.usask.ca. So there are supports available to you. I'm not one when it comes to this particular topic, but I want to highlight that there are people who can help you if you have questions about any of these softwares, right, or any of these programs. When it comes to sort of basic organization, keeping track of keywords and databases used is going to be very important, in part to ensure that you don't accidentally replicate some of your research later on. And it also might be that you might have to highlight these keywords, these databases in your methodology potentially, depending on what the expectations are. So having this information safe somewhere is going to help, again, to ensure that you're not reproducing that effort that you initially put in, and it will ensure that you can reference it if you need to later on. Or it might be just having conversations with your project lead or supervisor. They might want you to surface, okay, well, what keywords we're using, what databases, what sort of search strategies. So it's going to be a way to keep that communication very clear as well. So you can use a range of tables or matrices to track, organize, and comment on the scholarly literature. This is really important in part because good note keeping, especially early on in the research stage, is going to help protect against accidental plagiarism. Because if you forget that a particular bit of information is coming from a particular study, and you include that information, and you don't include reference to that study and haven't cited it, then it can be a problem in the future. So being on the ball with your note keeping is going to ensure that you're not going to run into this problem later on. And annotated bibliographies are something that can be very useful at this stage as well. This was surfaced by Kylie. And basically what this is a document where you are including the relevant citation information, and you're including a very basic summary in your own words. You're not simply taking the abstract and putting it into this document, but you're putting the summary of the study into your own words. Again, only about a paragraph or two. And you're also making comments about the relevance of this source for your own research project. And then that's going to help you then as you're looking at your literature review to determine whether or not you want to feature that source or not. This is a very basic sample organizational chart. So if you don't want to engage, if you don't want to create something as formal as an annotated bibliography, this can be a very efficient way for keeping track of your research question and all of those different sources. So I've just made up a research question here with some imaginary sources, but basically you can adjust this how you would want. Here we have that source information. You could include additional citation information in that column on the left, and then briefly what the research focus of the project was, the methodology used, and this is where it becomes especially useful, identifying strengths, limitations, or weaknesses, because in engaging and tracking these sort of comments, you are ensuring that your analysis doesn't get lost. And again, this is going to help you determine which sources you're going to include as part of your literature review and why you're going to include a reference to them in your literature review as well. And it's not that we discount sources that we determine have a lot of limitations. There might be something still very valuable that we want to surface in our literature review about that particular source, but we then provide a bit of context to explain its limitations as well. Another popular way of organizing your sources might be with something like Excel, and this was surfaced in the chat as well. I'm not an Excel expert, but I've identified for you two potential sources that you might find relevant. And so we have Dr. Elaine Gregerson's How I Use Excel to Manage My Literature Review, and I've included a hyperlink here. And then Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega's Conceptual Synthesis Excel Dump Technique. And he has actually created a template that you can make use of in order to track your own research. Yes, he has a really good blog that looks at a lot of the different ways in which you can go about making a literature review or an annotated bibliography as well. All right, so once you have some of this information together, you might also consider how some of these studies are going to start relating to each other and start figuring out how you might structure your literature review. So when we're thinking about a literature review, there are different ways of organizing literature reviews, but one of the most useful ways is usually thematically, and that's what will be looked at in detail next week. But just to give you an overview, so here our literature review, we have our introductory and our introduction at the beginning, our summary at the end, and in between we have some of these themes that we've surfaced. And each of these themes or some of these themes might have sub-themes within them, and some of those sub-themes might have a sub-sub-theme. And really, as a writer, as a researcher, you get to make a lot of determinations about what those themes are and what the structure of your literature review is going to look like. So for instance, if we were still looking at this research question of bone fractures in elderly populations, we might identify some central themes as bone density, interventions, cost, demographic shifts. And then within some of these themes, we might see, okay, here are some sub-themes, and then finally some sub-themes. And this is where, if you are making use of actual Post-it notes or sticky notes, this can be a really good opportunity to start playing with that structure, because we don't want to feel limited to a very linear structure so early in our organization and writing process. We want to have that flexibility to move information around if it makes more sense to our reader later on. So we might begin with a structure that looks like this, but then we might determine that actually, when I look at this in a bit more detail, there are really two major themes, but within these themes, we have more sub-themes and more sub-sub-themes. And some of the information that I identified as an important theme, that's actually just more contextual information. And that information can go into the introduction instead. So at this part, or rather at this stage of the research process and starting to move into the writing process, we still want to have that sense of flexibility in terms of how we're starting to conceptualize what that final product might look like. So some final tips. Systems only work if you stick with them. I'm a notorious purchaser of journals, and I never use them, but I'm always convinced that the new journal is going to be the difference. So I recognize that sometimes we want to implement a system because we think this time I'm going to stick with it. So it only will work if it is done consistently. So knowing your own work habits, your own style of approaching tasks is going to be very important when taking on these really large projects. So if you find someone who really responds well to color coding, use it. If you want to include more or fewer columns when tracking all of those sources, you can adjust those as needed. This is all stuff that can be made very personal to you as a researcher. What's important is that you are consistent so that the system supports you rather than becomes this enormous headache that is so stressful. It's really just a matter of, trying to keep things as simple for you as possible as a researcher. But again, I will reiterate again, good note keeping is going to help reduce the risk of accidental plagiarism. So your system might be scattershot, but as long as you are keeping track of where you're getting that information, that remains one of the most important things. So to start wrapping up, again, your university library has a lot of fantastic sources and services available to you. We might be working remotely, but we are working. We are available to connect. So if you have math questions, if you want support with study skills, research support, writing help, there are lots of folks that you can get in touch with at the library. So we did it. We got it within the hour. I can open it up to questions, and I'm happy to stick around beyond the hour. Or if you want to send me an email, feel free to do so, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. I'll put my video back up.
If anyone wants to ask a question orally, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question of Jill. I'm going to stop the recording so that nobody feels like that part of their questions will be recorded, but I'll stop the recording and then you can go ahead and ask your questions. Feel free to ask anything in the chat as well.
And I apologize for